So as you said, I'm Dave Basinger. I'm the Produce Safety Program Manager for the Utah Department of Agriculture and Food. I also wear other hats. I'm also the manager of the USDA GAP program, which is the Good Agricultural Program, which helps farms get a third-party food safety audit so that they can sell to grocery stores or produce companies that require a third-party audit. And then I also am the USDA Organic Program Manager for UDAF. So I certify operations in Utah to the National Organic Standards so that they can label and produce organic products. So at the end, if anybody has any questions regarding those, I'd be glad to take those off presentation. So today I've been asked to talk about the produce safety rule as far as it goes. So okay, so what the FDA Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Rule is it's a rule that was enacted by Congress in 2011, and the rules were finally published in 2016. And in 2017, the Utah Department of Agriculture adopted these rules. And the main reason why is so that we, as the state, would do the inspections and not FDA. So if you are a covered farm and you have an inspection, it will be from us and not FDA. And the context of this rule was to help head off foodborne illnesses due to contaminated produce. So that's been something that's occurred frequently since they started kind of keeping records in 1992. And so this rule was enacted to help try to get ahead of that and help in prevention and stop just reacting to these outbreaks and hopefully head some off before they ever happen. The water rule was enacted also in 2016. There were a lot of issues with it as far as it was more geared towards those states that grow year-round. And so the majority of the United States does not grow year-round. And so there was some real pushback and some real issues. And so FDA decided to pull that back and not have anybody inspect to that. And so they finally came out with something on May 6th of 2024 that fit more of the whole country. And that's what we're going to talk about today. But before everybody worries that this applies to them, there's certain credentials or categories you have to meet in order for this rule to apply to you. But there's a reason for this rule for these farms that are covered. And so if you're not covered, I would still challenge you to maybe take these to heart and implement them, because the last thing any farm wants to have is an outbreak or anybody wants to grow unsafe produce. So hopefully somebody or everybody can take a little bit of something away from this and implement that on their farm. But first of all, does this rule apply to my farm? So first of all, you have to grow what's called covered produce. And what this covered produce is, they came up with two categories: produce that's consumed raw and produce that's seldom consumed raw. Well, this is the list of produce that's consumed raw or typically consumed raw, but it's not an extensive list. So you can see there ETC at the bottom, and that's because there's always new produce coming in. And so there's tropical produce, there's produce from around the world that's coming in. And so they didn't want to just say, well, this is the list. But this is, if you're on this or you're growing produce, first of all, that's on this list, then you have the potential of this farm or this rule covering your farm. Now, I've highlighted in some of the black are some of the things that are typically grown around here. What I highlighted in red was to show the high priority produce. So this is what FDA has determined that the majority of outbreaks come from, and you can see cantaloupes, cucumbers, spinach, onions. There's been 3 outbreaks in the last 3 years with onions, tomatoes, peppers. So these are the ones that tend to have a little bit more issues or more association with outbreaks on farms. Now, non-covered produce. So this is produce that if you're just growing these are produce that's typically consumed after cooking. And there's some kind of weird things on here. I personally love to harvest sweet corn straight off of the stalk and eat it right there. My wife, not so much. She thinks I'm crazy for doing that, but typically sweet corn is cooked. Dill is another one that's sometimes chopped up fresh and put into dressings or maybe a quick fresh pickle or something like that. Beet tops, another thing that's eaten raw. But for FDA's concern, these things here are typically cooked. And so because they are cooked, they have a kill step. And so typically these are, if you're just growing these produce here, then you would not need to worry about the rule. But most farms are growing a collective of produce. We do have a few just straight sweet corn growers in the state that produce and sell to grocery stores. And so this rule would not be covered for them. There's also further steps whether or not you're a covered farm. So if you grow with inflation adjustment, right now it's just over $30,000 per year on an average of 3 years. So if you're below that $30,000 a year for a 3-year average, then you would be what's considered exempt. You would not need to comply with the rule. If you just use on-farm consumption or for personal, you're just passing out to your neighbors, those kind of things, again, you are not covered by the rule. Or if you send your produce for a commercial processing or a kill step, such as if I was to grow tomatoes and send it to a place that's making marinara sauce, there's going to be a kill step. Now, washing of produce is never a kill step. So a lot of times people like to think washing solves all my problems. I don't know how many times I've been driving. I live in Price. I drive the roads here, and there's asparagus all along the roads. And the day before I see the guy out spraying alongside the road, the next day people are out collecting asparagus, and I stop and tell them that's been sprayed, and they say, "Oh, we'll wash it off." Well, that doesn't really work. It's already inside the plant by that time. So, anyways, washing does not remove these contaminants. So, the next level will be a qualified exemption. Well, let me backtrack real quick. The exemption, the only paperwork you need to carry would be your financials, or not carry, but have if you were ever approached by an inspector or the state or the FDA, would be paperwork to show that you are making less than that $30 a year. So your financials. As far as qualified exemption, if you're making less than $600,000 in total food sales, so this isn't just produce, this is total food sales. So if I'm growing tomatoes that I'm selling to my neighbors and I have $1 million cattle operation, then I'm going to be covered by this because I'm over $600,000 with my cattle and total food sales, and I'm growing a covered produce. If I'm under 600,000 and I sell 51% of that to the end user, so I sell it at a farm market or a roadside stand or a restaurant or in a retail situation, just to the end user within 275 miles, I'm what's called qualified exempt. So both exempt or qualified exempts would not need inspection. They would not be covered by the rule. So in getting to our topic of agricultural water, what is agricultural water? So this is key throughout and is mentioned throughout the rule. So agricultural water is something that is water that contacts the either the edible portion of the fruit or a vegetable, or the food contact surface that this fruit or vegetable is going to actually contact. So we have an example in this picture of what is agricultural water on the left with the apples. Apples are a covered commodity, and you can see the water that's being used not only to transport the apples, but also there's a spray bar spraying apples. That would be agricultural water. Where on the right-hand side, if you remember on that list, there were beets. Beets are not covered. So even though this water is sprayed over the top, this would not be considered agricultural water because it's being used on a product that's not considered a covered produce. So covered activities. Covered activities where the water is considered agricultural water would be irrigation of crops. Again, it has to be covered produce though. Washing of produce, cooling, which I'll get into cooling a little bit later. This is one of the biggest things I see on farms that are exempt and covered and anywhere else that's done improperly within the state. Equipment cleaning, and probably the most important, which would be hand washing. So real quick, I just wanted to go over some examples of what's considered agricultural water and what is not. So remember, agricultural water has to contact either the food contact surface or the actual covered produce. So in the top left-hand corner, we have hydroponic tomatoes. The water is fed through a drip system, never comes in contact with the actual produce. So therefore, that is not agricultural water. Even though the produce is covered, it doesn't come in contact. Now, if all of a sudden one of those drippers was to get clogged and create some pressure and start spraying into the canopy, then it would be considered covered. It would be considered agricultural water. Below that picture, we have a field in Green River, a watermelon field. That water comes out of the pipes and contacts the produce as it moves by. That would be considered agricultural water. In the top right-hand corner, we have a couple different scenarios. So we have potatoes right there in the middle of the screen. And remember, potatoes are not covered. So therefore, the water underneath it would not be considered agricultural water. But the water to the right of it, you have onions. Remember, we've had multiple outbreaks with onions. Onions are on the raw list. They're consumed raw. And so that water underneath that would be considered agricultural water. And so, and I'll get to it in just a second why that's so important. The picture in the bottom right-hand corner, we have those same onions next to strawberries. So strawberries are covered, but now we're watering under plastic. That water does not come in contact with those strawberries, just like that top picture of the tomatoes. So underneath that, that would not be agricultural water. Now, if they were spraying over the top of it, then it would be agricultural water because it's contacting the actual produce. So the importance of safe agricultural water. So this is water that's going to contact our covered produce or our food contact surfaces. And the big issue is water can carry contamination. And so we want to minimize that contamination. So agricultural water is a potential source of contamination. Contaminated produce can lead to outbreaks. And as I mentioned earlier, the whole part of this rule is to try to minimize as much as possible contamination. And it's very crucial that growers comply with this because that's, minimizing the contamination is going to not only help their farms, but produce safe produce, but it's a big financial win not to have your farm linked to a contamination outbreak. So meeting agricultural water standards. So this is one of the issues and was touched on a little bit in the previous presentation. So when they conducted this rule or enacted this rule, one of the issues was that there hadn't really been any studies. And so the closest study or closest implementation of water quality standards was the recreational water standard that's used for lakes and rivers for for recreation. And so, and what that is it's no more than 126 coliform units of generic E. coli per 100 milliliters. And so, what that says is that for me to conduct certain things, such as growing, if I'm growing those strawberries or growing those onions, that my water needs to meet that requirement. It needs to be below 126 generic E. coli coliforming units per 100 milliliters. So it depends on the use. So if I'm irrigating, I can use that water, which we like to call here in Utah secondary water. But if I'm using it in a hand wash station like here, that should not have any type of contamination. That should be potable water or culinary water or drinking water. So there's certain requirements that water has to meet for what its intended use is. So if I'm cleaning food contact surfaces, that needs to be culinary water. If I'm using it for hand washing, it needs to be culinary water. So if I'm washing produce, it needs to be culinary water. If I'm growing, then it can be secondary water, but it needs to meet specific standards. Okay, and as I just mentioned, I just actually covered some of that. So if I'm using well water, I may have to do some testing in this situation where I'm washing the apples to make sure that my well water meets the testing for generic E. coli. That it has zero in that. Water for direct produce must be safe, as I mentioned before, and testing is required with the exception of municipal water. So if I'm getting my water and I'm washing my produce or I'm irrigating my produce with municipal water, that does not have to be tested. It's already tested by the municipal water source, and they guarantee that it meets the standards. I know that there's quite a few people that would then be able to irrigate their gardens with the secondary water. Um, but let's make sure that we're not washing that produce with that secondary water. So once I harvest that produce, I need to use the faucets on my house that are culinary water in order to wash that produce. Now, in the new rule, and I'll go into a little bit the last 10 minutes or so, what the difference between the old rule and the new rule is. The new rule wants you to do an agricultural water assessment. So what this is it's an assessment of your whole water system. So from where you receive it to where you actually comes out of the faucet and you use that. So there may be growers on here that are commercial that get stuff from a canal. There may be small growers that are only using, their faucet, their house water, because that's all they have. You would still do an assessment. Now, if I'm just using municipal water, my assessment may be pretty quick and easy, saying that I'm using treated water, and so therefore my assessment is that I don't have uh, a lot of risk. It could be that I need to maybe roll up my hose, or I need to make sure that that I'm not reusing water for washing, those kind of things. And so assessment is different based off of what your water source is. So you need to determine what are the conditions that I receive my water, what are the hazards that could be. So that top picture has cows along the bank of the canal. I know for a fact that there is a vegetable farm downstream from this. And so they need to realize, okay, there's a source, there's an issue that I can't do much with because the farmer has the right to have his cows in there. And so what do I need to do? What are the issues, or what do I need to do in order to make sure that my water is safe for use in my vegetables? So I'm going to do an assessment on my system and identify those cows as a potential risk, and then what am I going to do to remedy that? And it may not be that I can get the farmer to move his cows, or does he have to? The picture below is a puddle right next to my well. not only does it could the water contaminate my well because I've got leaky water there. This is actually on a citrus farm in Florida that I was on, and the water was only about 6 feet deep. So therefore, there wasn't enough time for that water to get through the layers in order to have it properly um, filtered in order to remove those contaminants. The other thing that this would do is draw in wildlife that would also bring contamination. So part of my assessment would be risk management. So, like I said, we're going to take the whole system, we're going to assess it, we're going to find where the risk is. And it could be based, like I mentioned earlier, on water source, the proximity to potential contamination, like the picture before with the animals. Maybe it's a closed canal, so I don't have that. And so in my risk assessment, it's going to be that there's minimal chance for animal contamination. Maybe it's I'm going to treat my water, which probably isn't for a small farm a very viable method. So we're going to implement these risks. Now, this photo was taken at that same research farm. I don't know that we'll have this type of risk as far as an alligator attacking you, but what that alligator is leaving behind in that water would be the risk that we would worry about for watering our crops. The previous rule was all about test, test, test. This one does not mention too much about testing. And that was the big issue with the previous rule was it wanted you to test and test and test and test. And then when you had issues, test some more. The assessment does not say you have to test, but at the same time, how do you properly assess your water if you're using a secondary system? How do you assess your water if you don't test? But what this new rule allows you to do is through your water assessment, you can now assess how many tests. If your water, for the most part, is fairly clean, you're at the front of the canal, you don't typically have a lot of issues, it might be testing once a year. It might be testing twice a year. If you're at the end of the canal and the canal's open the whole way, maybe once prior to harvest, once during harvest, and once towards the end is maybe what you would want to do. So it allows you your assessment to dictate how much testing is done. And if you do have testing done, you definitely want to make sure you keep those as part of your paperwork. As far as mitigation strategies, so once you have your risks noted and you've assessed, now you want to implement your mitigation strategies. How do you mitigate those risks? What are you going to do? Are you going to turn off water a few days before you start harvesting? Stop watering so that everything can dry out. You can create buffer zones between the canal and where your livestock are, if you have livestock on your operation. So this is the new rule, is all about assessment and mitigation strategies. If you are covered by the rule, you would want to make sure you keep your assessment, your water testing results, your water treatment information. So if you are treating your water, you want to make sure that you document when you inspect your water source and the dates and who inspected it. And typically, if you are covered by the rule, you want to do this assessment. Well, you have to do this assessment one time per year, and typically you want to do it prior to harvest. As I mentioned earlier, the old rule was all about testing, and it wasn't flexible. It was you had to do this many tests a year. The only flexibility was when you were doing those testing. And so it outlined what type of test, when you were testing, and then how often. And so the new one, like I mentioned, it really shifts to a risk-based assessment of your system. It allows for flexibility in your testing. It also allows for flexibility on your mitigation. So it's not going to say you have to put in a $100,000 water treatment center. There's other ways that you can mitigate. So it doesn't tell you how to do that. You have to come up with the mitigation strategies that works best for your farm. And so just to go back again, the old rule was all about testing. The new one is more of a risk-based system approach, inspecting your whole system, making sure you understand your system, how it functions. If you are covered by the rule, if you're one of those really large farms that does over $600,000 a year in total food sales, April 7th of this year, you have to be in compliance. So you would have to implement your assessment this year and have your mitigation, your risks outlined and your mitigation strategies. If you're one of those, if you're covered by the rule, so you do under this is an older slide, so I'm using figures with the inflation adjustment. So if you're between 250,000 and 600,000 and you sell to a grocery store that further distributes, you have 1 year to get your risk assessment and your water system assessment into place. If you're a very small business, so you sell again more than 51% of your product goes for further distribution, you have 2 years in order to comply with that. And then while I've got about 2 minutes left, I kind of wanted to go over just a couple things of what I see commonly on farms, not only large farms, but small farms that I've been on. And we're going to call them pearls. So you definitely do not, if you are going to test your water, do not test it right after a rain event. I've been on a farm where we took a water test and the test was about 32 CFUs. And so it was really good quality. It rained. They took a test right after the rain event and it was over 14,000. And so, you think of a heavy rain event, all those things get washed down into the river and to the canals, and that ends up on the farm. So if you are going to test your water, make sure you don't do it right after a rain event, especially a heavy rain event, because it's not going to give you an accurate measurement of what your water actually is on a daily basis. Wait till after a rain event to harvest your crops. Make sure it's dry. One thing you don't want to do is wipe the produce. That's something that we see really common is someone will go out and harvest some cantaloupe or something like that, and they'll be dirty, and so they'll wipe it. Well, if that first cantaloupe is contaminated and now it gets on your rag, every next cantaloupe you wipe, now you're introducing potential contamination to those. So try not to wipe your produce off. Do not harvest as part of if your field has flooded, and that's part of the law, and that goes into a flooded field is considered adulterated or potentially adulterated. So if you do have flooding in your field, the canal overfills and floods, or you have a rain event and that floods that section of your field, you would not want to harvest. One thing, do not dismiss risks. So I see a lot of people that will do a risk assessment and they're just like, yeah, I don't have any risk. Look closer because you probably have something, it may be pretty minimal and something easy to mitigate, but don't just completely dismiss it. And probably the biggest one I see is people reusing water to cool. And so they'll get a bucket of water, like the bucket you see here. It's got multiple different produce. They'll fill it with water, and then they will they'll dip the produce in it, which again, if you've got something that's contaminated, and now everything I dip into that water afterwards. So I would recommend if you're going to use something to cool or wash your produce, use single pass water, meaning I spray it off and I don't just sit and dip things, because this is where we see a lot of issues with infiltration of contaminated water into produce that's not done properly. And the last point is you cannot sell, no matter what, this is still in the law, you cannot sell adulterated or potentially adulterated produce at any time. It doesn't matter what size you are or how big you are. If you're covered by this rule, this is actually in the Wholesome Food Act. So you can't, if you have something that is adulterated or potentially adulterated, you cannot sell that. With that, I will end. 1 minute.